It began with a scream that didn't belong in the forest. John, a weathered man in his late 60s, froze mid-step as the sound sliced through the morning mist. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It echoed, mournful and raw, like the forest itself was in agony. His grip tightened on the handle of his worn axe as he scanned the dense woods around him. "A cougar, maybe," he muttered under his breath, though the unease in his chest told him otherwise. The scream came again, this time closer. John's pulse quickened. Living alone in the remote Montana wilderness, he had heard his fair share of wild animals, but nothing like this. A primal instinct told him to turn back to the safety of his cabin, but his curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, urged him forward. The fog hung heavy in the air, turning the forest into an endless maze of shadow and light. Each step John took felt like an intrusion, the silence between the screams growing louder. Then he saw it, a dark mass sprawled at the base of an old cedar tree, surrounded by a smear of red against the snow-covered ground. It was a bear cub. Not just any cub. This one was unnaturally small, its fur ashen gray, almost spectral against the stark white snow. One of its paws was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a deep gash ran along its flank, oozing blood. The bear's chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths, its eyes half-lidded but eerily aware. John hesitated. A bear cub meant a mother nearby, and if she caught him anywhere near her young, he'd be finished. But as he scanned the surroundings, he saw no sign of tracks leading in or out. The cub was alone. "How did you get here, little guy?" John's voice was barely above a whisper. The cub's ears twitched, its eyes locking onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The wound wasn't fresh. The edges were dark, almost charred, as if it had been burned rather than cut. And there was something else, an unnatural glow, faint but unmistakable, pulsing beneath the skin around the gash. John rubbed his eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the glow persisted. He took a cautious step closer, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The cub didn't flinch or growl, it simply watched him, its gaze heavy with something that felt like recognition. John crouched down, every muscle in his body taut, and reached out a trembling hand. The moment his fingers brushed the cub's fur, a surge of heat shot through him, jolting him back. The air around them seemed to hum, and for a brief second, the forest was alive with whispers, faint, unintelligible, but undeniably real. Then it was gone, leaving only the rasping breaths of the injured cub and John's pounding heart. "What in God's name?" he whispered, staring at his hand, which now tingled as if he touched a live wire. Logic told him to leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. But something rooted him to the spot, a gnawing sense of responsibility that he couldn't shake. The cub was dying, and if he walked away, its blood would be on his hands. Muttering a curse, John removed his coat and carefully wrapped the cub, ignoring the faint warmth radiating from its body. The whispers returned, faint and fleeting, like the forest itself was protesting his decision. He ignored them and hoisted the cub into his arms. The trek back to his cabin was grueling. The cub was heavier than it looked, and the uneven terrain fought him every step of the way. The strange glow around its wound grew brighter, casting ghostly patterns on the snow. Twice, John thought he heard movement behind him, a rustling that stopped the moment he turned. By the time he reached the cabin, his muscles burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Inside, he placed the cub on an old blanket by the fire. It lay still, its breathing shallow but steady. John fetched a first aid kit, though he doubted the gauze and antiseptic would do much for whatever this was. As he cleaned the wound, he noticed the glow pulsating rhythmically, like a heartbeat. For a brief moment, he thought he saw shapes in the light, fleeting, shadowy figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. "You're no ordinary bear, are you?" he murmured, half expecting an answer. The cub's eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with an intensity that froze him in place. Then it did something that nearly made his heart stop. It nodded. Not a twitch or a flinch, but a deliberate, unmistakable nod. John stumbled back, his mind racing. This was no ordinary bear. This was something else entirely. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to understand. But ready or not, he was now a part of it. And whatever this was, it was only the beginning. John didn't sleep that night. The bear cub lay motionless by the fire, its rhythmic breathing the only sound in the small cabin. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters like an uninvited guest demanding entry. But it wasn't the wind that kept John's eyes wide open. It was the glow. The strange, pulsing light from the cub's wound hadn't dimmed. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger, casting faint, shifting patterns on the cabin walls. Occasionally, the light would flicker, and for the briefest moments, John thought he saw faces in the glow, shadowy figures watching him, their expressions unreadable. He sat in his old armchair, a rifle resting across his lap. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, or who. But a nagging instinct told him that whatever had harmed this bear wasn't finished. Around midnight the whispers began. At first, John thought it was the wind playing tricks on him. But as the minutes passed, the murmurs grew distinct, though the words were incomprehensible. It was as if a dozen voices were speaking in unison, their tones ranging from soft and pleading to harsh and commanding. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was emanating from the bear. John stood, his heart hammering against his ribs. "All right, what in God's name are you?" he muttered, his voice trembling. The cub stirred. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the firelight, opened and locked onto John's. Then the whisper stopped. Silence pressed down on the room like a physical weight. The cub blinked slowly, almost deliberately, before shifting its gaze to the far corner of the cabin. John followed its eyes, his grip tightening on the rifle. The corner was empty, just a shadowy patch where the firelight didn't reach. But then he saw it, movement. A flicker, like the ripple of heat over asphalt, only colder. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, forming a shape that defied logic. Eyes. Two pinpoints of light, cold and unfeeling, blinked into existence within the darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the cabin with a cacophony of voices. John aimed the rifle at the corner, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Stay back!" he shouted, though his voice sounded small against the roar of the whispers. The shadowy figure didn't move closer, but neither did it retreat. Instead, it seemed to shift, the eyes fixed on the bear cub. The cub let out a low growl, a sound that didn't belong in its small frame. The glow around its wound flared brightly, illuminating the room in an eerie, golden light. The shadow recoiled, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind, before vanishing completely. The whispers stopped. John stood frozen, the rifle still aimed at the now empty corner. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, and sweat dripped from his brow. He slowly lowered the gun, his eyes darting around the cabin. The cub lay still once more, the glow around its wound dimming but not disappearing. "You scared it off," John said, his voice shaky. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the bear or to himself. The cub made no sound, but its eyes followed him as he moved back to his chair. John sank into it heavily, his hands trembling. He glanced at the rifle, then at the cub, and finally at the corner where the shadow had been. "What have I gotten myself into?" he murmured. The hours dragged on, the glow from the cub's wound pulsing like a heartbeat. John's exhaustion finally overtook his fear, and he drifted into a fitful sleep, his dreams filled with shadowy figures and glowing eyes. When he woke, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the windows. The cabin was silent, the whispers gone. The cub was awake, sitting upright for the first time, its gaze fixed on John. "You're not just any bear, are you?" John asked, his voice rough from sleep. The bear tilted its head slightly, almost as if it understood. John shook his head, running a hand through his gray hair. "All right," he said. "If we're doing this, we're doing it my way. But you've got some explaining to do." The bear blinked, its eyes glowing faintly, and John felt a strange sense of understanding pass between them. Whatever this was, it was far from over. And for better or worse, John knew he couldn't turn back now. By the next morning, The strange events of the night still weighed heavily on John's mind. The cabin, though silent, felt charged with an unspoken tension, as if the air itself remembered the whispers and shadows. The bear cub sat near the fireplace, its small body still and alert. Its wound glowed faintly, casting a golden hue that flickered like a dying flame. John poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he carried it to the table. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, and the presence of this strange creature, though silent, filled the cabin with an eerie companionship. "So, what now?" he asked aloud, his voice rough in the stillness. The cub's ears twitched, but it didn't move. The knock at the door made John's heart leap into his throat. He hadn't had visitors in months, and the unexpected sound sent a chill down his spine. Rifle in hand, he approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Through the frost-covered window, he could make out a figure wrapped in a thick coat, their face obscured by a scarf and hat. "Who's there?" John called, his voice steady despite the unease twisting in his gut. "Just passing through," came the reply, muffled by the scarf. "Got turned around in the woods. Thought I'd ask for directions." John opened the door a crack, enough to see the stranger's face. It was a man, young, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the cabin in a single glance. "You lost?" John asked, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Something like that," the man replied, his eyes drifting past John to the interior of the cabin. For a moment, his gaze lingered on the bear cub, and John felt his stomach drop. "Not much out here," John said quickly, stepping to block the man's view. "Road's about 2 miles west. Follow it, and you'll hit town." The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Appreciate it," he said, though his tone carried no gratitude. "You take care now." As the stranger turned to leave, John felt a knot of unease tighten in his chest. He waited until the man disappeared into the tree line before shutting the door and bolting it tightly. "We've got company," he muttered to the cub, who had watched the exchange silently. The bear's eyes glimmered with a knowing intensity, as if it understood far more than John was comfortable with. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the snow, John's unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's visit had been no coincidence. The forest, usually a sanctuary, now felt hostile, its darkness hiding unseen threats. The cub's wound flared brighter as night fell, the golden light pulsing in time with John's racing thoughts. Unable to sit idle, he paced the cabin, muttering to himself. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" he asked the cub, stopping to stare at it. "That man. The shadows. Whatever's out there, they're after you." The cub's gaze met his, unblinking, and John felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he felt an overwhelming need to protect this strange creature, no matter the cost. The first sign of trouble came just past midnight. A faint rustling outside, followed by the crunch of snow beneath heavy boots. John's heart pounded as he grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. In the pale moonlight, he could make out 2 figures moving through the trees, their silhouettes dark against the snow. They were searching for something. No, not something. Someone. John extinguished the lantern and crouched near the fireplace, his eyes never leaving the window. The cub moved closer to him, its body tense, and its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The figures drew nearer, their voices low but audible in the still night. "He's here," one of them said. "I can feel it. We'll flush him out," the other replied. John's grip on the rifle tightened. His mind raced, weighing his options. He could confront them, but 2 against 1 were not odds he liked. Hiding seemed futile, the cabin was too small, too exposed. And then there was the cub, whose presence seemed to draw these people like moths to a flame. A sudden crash shattered the tension. One of the figures had kicked in the door, and the cold night air rushed into the cabin. John raised the rifle, his finger on the trigger. "Step back," he barked, his voice steady despite the chaos. The intruders froze, their eyes locking onto the cub. The glow from its wound flared, filling the cabin with a golden light so bright it was almost blinding. The intruders shielded their eyes, stumbling back as the light intensified. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The cabin plunged into darkness, and when John's eyes adjusted, the intruders were gone. Outside, the forest was silent once more. John sank to the floor, his body trembling. The cub pressed against him, its warmth a small comfort in the cold, dark cabin. Whatever this was, John knew it wasn't over. The weight of secrets hung heavy in the air, and John could only hope he was strong enough to carry them. The dawn broke with an uneasy calm. The events of the night before lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. John sat by the fire, his rifle propped against the wall, the bear cub curled at his feet. Its wound no longer glowed as brightly, but the faint, golden light remained, pulsing gently like the heartbeat of some ancient, hidden force. John rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident in the dark circles under his eyes. The intruders, the shadows, the whispers, all of it felt like a bad dream, but the tension in his chest told him otherwise. Whatever this was, it had only just begun. As the morning light crept through the windows, John stood and stretched, his joints creaking in protest. "All right, little guy," he said, glancing at the cub. "Time to figure out what we're dealing with." He packed a small bag, a few supplies, his rifle, and the old leather journal he used to jot down notes about the forest. The cub watched him with its intense, unblinking eyes, its body language calm but alert. "We can't stay here," John muttered. "If those men come back, we're sitting ducks." He opened the cabin door, the cold morning air biting at his face. The forest stretched before them, its silence both comforting and foreboding. The snow, untouched except for his footprints from the night before, glistened under the weak sunlight. With the cub tucked under one arm, John stepped out, the crunch of snow beneath his boots breaking the stillness. The pair moved cautiously through the woods, John's eyes scanning every shadow and tree line. He didn't know where they were going, but staying put felt like a death sentence. The cub, surprisingly cooperative, seemed to guide him, occasionally nudging him in one direction or another with its small nose. As they walked, John's mind raced. The intruders had been searching for the cub, of that he was certain. But why? And what was it about this creature that drew not just men, but shadows and whispers from the depths of the unknown? Midday found them at the edge of a frozen river. John paused, his breath visible in the crisp air, and set the cub down. The little bear sniffed at the ice, its eyes reflecting the sunlight with an almost otherworldly brilliance. "You're not just a bear, are you?" John said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're something else. Something they want." The cub turned its gaze to him, and for a moment, John felt a wave of understanding pass between them. It wasn't words, but it was clear. The cub wasn't ordinary. It was something ancient, something powerful, and it had chosen him. The realization hit him like a freight train. "Oh no," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not the guy for this. I'm just some old fool living in the woods. You need, I don't know, someone younger, stronger. Someone who knows what the hell they're doing." The cub's ears twitched, and it stepped closer to him, pressing its small body against his leg. John sighed, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. "All right," he said. "All right. But you'd better be worth all this trouble." As they prepared to cross the river, a distant sound made John freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, voices. He turned, his heart hammering, and saw movement in the distance. Figures were emerging from the tree line, their silhouettes dark against the snow. "Damn it!" John hissed, grabbing the cub and bolting across the ice. His boots slid on the slick surface, but he kept his balance, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The figures moved closer, their pace quickening as they spotted him. Halfway across the river, the ice cracked beneath John's feet. He stopped, his heart leaping into his throat. "Not now," he muttered, shifting his weight carefully. The cub let out a low growl, its eyes glowing faintly once more. The men reached the riverbank, their voices carrying over the frozen expanse. "There! He's got it!" one of them shouted. John tightened his grip on the cub and took a cautious step forward. The ice groaned, but it held. Another step, then another. The men began to follow, their boots crunching loudly against the brittle surface. Suddenly, the cub let out a sharp cry, its glow intensifying. The ice beneath them erupted in a brilliant flash of light, and John felt himself falling. The world became a blur of cold and darkness as the icy water swallowed him. When he surfaced, gasping for air, he realized he was on the far bank. The cub was beside him, shivering but unharmed. The river had split, a jagged, glowing line running through the ice where they had crossed. The men were stranded on the opposite side, shouting angrily but unable to follow. John collapsed onto the snow, his body trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. The cub climbed onto his chest, its warmth a small comfort against the biting wind. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice weak but tinged with a hint of awe. The cub's glow dimmed, its eyes meeting his with that same unyielding intensity. John closed his eyes, the weight of the journey finally catching up to him. As sleep claimed him, one thought lingered in his mind: this was far from over.